Okay, so next we're going to start looking at the legal view, and I'd like to welcome Ralph and Anneke onto the stage. Ralph Giles and Anneke Paul, who are associates at Bristow's and former colleagues of mine, so I'm very happy to see them here today. But yeah, they'll be having a look, you figure out what's more comfortable for you, but we've got some mics if you need them over there. But yes, both Ralph and Anneke work with enterprises, businesses on their legal and commercial aspects of major IT projects, et cetera, and of course looking at emerging technologies and sustainability as part of that. And I will let them take it from here.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, it's great to be here today. So as Alexander was just saying, we're both lawyers in London at a firm called Bristow's. And we both work in the tech sector, but we've got a real keen interest in ESG and open source and the overlap between the two. And I think it's this button. There we go.
So according to the Open Source and Sustainability Report published earlier this year, there are roughly 1,300 active ESG-related projects hosted on GitHub, GitLab, and other platforms. But out of the millions of projects hosted on GitHub, this is a relatively small percentage. Even though it's a relatively small percentage, it's having a big impact. So the LF Energy Research and Proton Types report published on Monday last week found that open source software is driving sustainability innovation, including for energy system modelling. Ralph and I have been thinking about this from a legal perspective and thinking about some of the potential obstacles and opportunities that it presents. And we've identified the following 5 legal obstacles: lack of publicly available, verifiable ESG-related data, use of non-standard licensing terms for ESG OSS projects, ESG reporting requirements, current public policy approaches to open source, and a lack of alignment between industry and academia. So today we'll be discussing ways to overcome, go around, or go over these legal obstacles. We think that ESG and open source is an area ripe for cross-pollination with a little bit of legal fertilizer.
Lovely. So today we're going to split it into 3 different parts. We're going to focus our talk from a legal perspective, but we're going to start with setting up a project, so open source by design. And to us, that means putting in place internal policies within your business, your university, or wherever you work, and also thinking about contracts with your customers and how you deal with open source there. The next stage, we're going to think about how could, what could impact my project in this world. So legal issues with non-standard licenses and how that could affect or negatively impact the proliferation of ESG open source projects, and also touch on ESG regulation that's forthcoming, which will touch on corporate disclosure requirements of ESG data, meaning that more of that data can be publicly available and hopefully more open source projects. And then finally, we'll just wrap up with what this all means for the open source community. So the first thing to think about is when starting a project, so I've just touched on, think about the legal issues that affect open source. So that means putting policies in place, and also think about the extent to which you want to interact with open source and what kind of license you'll want to use or best suits your needs. But the key point is, don't make the legal part of your open source ESG project an afterthought.
So in the Open Source and Environmental Sustainability Report, the authors grouped the organizations affiliated with active ESG OSS projects into 6 groups. And interestingly, you can see that academia is about 23% and government agency about 15%. The authors went into this data further and ranked the organizations, if you can read it here on the right, by the number of active projects in GitHub. Interestingly, you can see right at the top, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is the national laboratory of the US Department of Energy, and also the US Environmental Protection Agency, have a large number of active projects in GitHub. This could potentially be because in 2016, the US government published a federal source code policy by Tony Scott and Anne Rung, and it established a 3-year pilot program that required agencies, when commissioning a new custom software, to release at least 20% as open source. Similarly, you may be able to see about towards the top the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts. This could also potentially be because the European Commission has an internal open source software strategy which promotes the sharing and use of software for the benefit of the European Union. A possible explanation why these organizations have a larger number of active projects is that they thought about their OSS approach. And we encourage you to also think about your OSS approach. So this is an open source policy that Ralph and I have worked on for an organization. If you are starting an ESG project, please turn your mind to what will be your OSS approach. It doesn't need to be anything nearly as comprehensive as this. Literally, some bullet points in an email is enough.
This was only page 1.
Yeah, this is only page 1. For this policy, we tackled 3 key topics. So the first was engineers that wanted to contribute to an existing OSS project. The second was company wanted to bring in OSS components and software into its proprietary products. And the third was, if the company wanted to make its own code open source, how would it decide which parts of its code and under which license? So this is one of the decision trees in the policy. And as you can see at the bottom, we considered all the different types of OSS licenses. The brilliant thing about an OSS policy is that you are literally discussing your approach with your team, so everyone is on the literal same page. So a lot of amazing research is coming out of universities, and there's brilliant researchers and academics who work there. If you are in an academic group and even thinking about making your ESG project or a part of your ESG project open source, then we recommend that you start the conversation with your team and set up a version of an OSS policy. It's important to do that at the start when people are excited about the project, because you can also set the trajectory for the coming years. Seek any approvals and sign-offs early from the university. It doesn't mean that you need to use the approval, but it does give you the option at a later stage if you do want to make a component of your ESG project open source. And the third is, as Ralph said, create a considered approach with your team. Don't let OSS be something that is a conversation at the end. These here are all universities that do have an open source approach or approvals process to make your ESG project open source. For example, the University College London has an open source software sustainability fund that will provide small grants of up to £10,000 per project for projects that either already exist as an open source project under a standard license, underlining the word standard, or for closed projects that could be made open.
So in order to try and bring this to life a bit, we thought we'd describe a case study. So this is basically a real client we've acted for. So Pear Inc. Has developed this piece of code, and the software is designed to help businesses measure their greenhouse gas emissions. And that will enable those businesses to report on the impacts they have on the environment, identify areas of their business where emissions could be reduced. So Pear Inc. has provided a license to its customer, and the parties agreed that the customer can have an option under that license to open source the code for that software. And now Pear Inc. have come to us asking for advice to think about what kind of things they need to think about if the customer exercises that option. So Anneke.
So these were some clauses that were in the agreement that Ralph and I sort of analysed. And I think it's really important to highlight that Pear Inc. wanted to release this source code as open source because they wanted to promote their engineering skills and achievements. The customer also, which was a very big company, also wanted to release the source code because there were reputational benefits to it. So the key things that Pear Inc. needed to think about were what license would they use? Were they going to use permissive or copyleft? And there were actually very strong benefits to them for using either type of license. The other thing was, would it create a security risk? So would publishing the vulnerabilities to this portion of code compromise Pear Inc.'s other products? Would it impact the ability for the company to differentiate itself from its competitors if the code was to a core product or potentially to an auxiliary piece of code? And then the last one was, do any third parties have rights to the code that Pear Inc. needs to receive sign-off before it's published? So to make sure that everyone has credit for their work.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, as reported in the Open Source in Environmental Sustainability report that Anneke was talking about earlier, you'll see on the graph here that almost a quarter of the ESG projects that are in those various repositories are published under custom licenses. And whilst this can be a fun, innovative way of publishing code, there are a number of boring legal issues that can arise when you're using these non-standard licenses. And so we thought that this would be a really good opportunity to say to you, as the open source community, that standard licenses are the way forward, and because of these issues that can arise. And so some of the reasons why, for example, would be that standard licenses are more likely to be within a company's sort of approved list of OSS licenses. And so your code is more likely to be adopted, developed, and used. So thinking about some of those issues, Annike's going to show you some examples of different licenses where problems arise.
Thanks, Ralph. People are doing some pretty funky and cool things with their IP licenses. So an example of that is a GitHub project, JA side panel, and what we see here is a pretty boring legal IP clause, but at the end we have an interesting sentence. So this is a take on the 2016 Beware license, which essentially states that you need to buy the license Sorabia. The Fedora project and the humanitarian FOSS project by Trinity College recognized version 42 of the Beware license to be a permissive copyright-only license that is GPL compatible. Interestingly, you need to buy the license or a beer no matter how you use the code, but beware. If you meet the licensor in a bar and they feel like they don't want a beer that day, they actually prefer a whiskey, you will be in breach of this license. So the next one is one that we're seeing much more for GitHub ESG projects, which is where you take a standard license like an MIT license and add a treeware amendment. So there's currently sort of two versions of the license out there. The first one is saying that you are required to buy the world a tree. And then the second one is saying, then we ask that you buy the world a tree. So the first is a requirement. You must do this, otherwise you will be in breach of the license. The second one raises a little bit of ambiguity. Can you not? Is it an ask? We would be of the opinion that an ask is not a requirement. The words buy the world a tree are also open to interpretation. Does this mean that you could plant a tree in your own backyard and benefit from it? Or do you have to use an organization and list the gift recipient as the world? Interestingly as well, the very first version doesn't comply with the definition of open source by the Open Source Initiative, which says in Rule 1, the license shall not require royalty or fee for such sale. So requiring the user to purchase a tree makes the treeware license fall outside the definition, the open source definition. It also introduces complications about whether the treeware amendment is compatible with other types of licenses. So Section 2 of GPL version 2 states that you must not impose further restrictions on the recipient's exercise of the rights. So technically, the treeware amendment would not be compatible with GPL version 2.
It wouldn't be a legal talk without referring to some section of the license, I think, yeah.
This is an interesting one floating out there, which is good luck with that production license, and says, we wish a very good luck to any future self, fellow being, or alien, or AI bot, literally anyone who dares to use this code, essentially. And it also suggests that you can use this if you have a college university course lab work. we suggest that you do not, that you set up the OSS policy that we mentioned earlier. And we're going to quickly highlight why we recommend that you don't just pick up any old license. So these are some really high-level, quick legal points. The first one is basically a warranty, saying that you get this code as is, but it doesn't disclaim warranties implied by statute. The second one is a moral rights waiver. Do we have a... Oh, no.
Yeah, same one.
Okay. The second one is a moral rights waiver. So if you go down here, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't track it to the author. So even though it's almost a moral rights waiver, or more specifically a waiver of the right to attribution, it doesn't quite get you there, because actually it's saying that you cannot track it to the author. And then the last one is saying that the author shall not be liable for any claim, etc. But it doesn't exclude indirect and consequential loss. And more importantly, the use of the word tort here under the laws of England and Wales doesn't explicitly exclude tortious claims, tortious negligence claims, which means that the authors will have unlimited liability if someone brings a tortious negligence claim against them. It is very complicated to relicense and to change your license later. So please learn from Mozilla, who took about 5 years to relicense Firefox, Thunderbird, and related software. As Ralph already mentioned, about a quarter of active ESG open source projects are using custom licenses. And this can really limit the growth and reach of the project, because the academic and other organizations' OSS policy will normally explicitly exclude custom licenses. This presents an amazing opportunity for you, for your ESG OSS project, to pick a standard license from the start. So we would recommend these two websites, Choose a License, or the Open Source Initiative's approved license list.
Great, thank you. So we've talked a lot about open source, and now I'm just going to touch on some forthcoming legal updates that could also drive positive change. So as we heard in Emily's talk just now, the climate crisis and sustainability are consistently key items on the government's agenda. And we're also seeing government policy supporting openness. So as mentioned before, we think there's this obvious cross-pollination or overlap between the two. So as tech lawyers, we support clients with large business process outsourcing projects and general IT procurement. And we work with a lot of government departments, Crown bodies, and the NHS. And IP ownership is always a hot topic in contract negotiations. It's generally really important for customers to be able to use the IP after the contract has ended. And that's particularly relevant in the public sector, because other government bodies will need to be able to share knowledge, share IP, and use different bits of things that are developed for them. And this has led to the government's open standard principles, which support openness. And these relate to software interoperability, and the key points really are to focus on equal access to government IT contracts for open source and proprietary software providers. And that's going to improve flexibility and the ability to cooperate with other government organisations, and also have cost-saving benefits for each government body. And looking at Oliver Dowden's statement there, so government technology must remain open to everyone. We know there are areas of government which have not fully embraced these principles, and we're determined to create an environment where openness can succeed. There's a further nod to supporting openness in the model services contract, which is a template contract which is used by public bodies for high value, so generally over 20 million, complex transactions. And the important point is it reflects the government's current priorities and recommended ways of doing business. And in some circumstances, the model services contract requires the supplier to allow, i.e. the government, the supplier to allow the government, i.e. the customer, to publish specially written software under an open license. So this is that further nod to supporting public policy, supporting open source. Go to the next slide. You got the clicker. Oh, brilliant. Sorry. Way ahead of me. So from a legislative perspective, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I'm going to apologise now. There's lots of acronyms, lots of letters, but the CSRD is an EU directive, and the EU is leading the way on ESG regulation. But this directive will also touch non-EU companies, so that includes companies from the UK. It came into force in January 2023 this year, and it revises and builds on the NFRD, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. And the purpose of that was to require large listed companies of more than 500 employees, essentially, to provide non-financial disclosure related to sustainability. The problem with the NFRD is that there was no sort of disclosure alignment on what was being published by different companies. The obligation was more on a comply or explain basis, so there was no standardized way of reporting ESG data. But the CSRD is designed to make these disclosures, much more standardized, like financial reporting. And it's also going to broaden the scope of companies that are affected by this obligation from roughly 15,000 to about 50,000. And that includes, as I mentioned, non-EU companies that have substantial activity in the EU. So essentially, this means there's going to be a lot more ESG-related data publicly available, which will hopefully encourage more open source projects in the sector, hopefully leading, to more of those projects. So the reporting standards, there's three main ones that we're going to focus on today. So the ESRS, I'm not going to say the whole title, that's the standards for the CSRD, and that was going to touch EU and non-EU entities, and it's broken down into general mandatory disclosures and also topical disclosures on environment, social and governance, depending on what sector your business is in. The second standard is the IFRS, and that's even more recently published, 26th of June this year. And these haven't yet been endorsed by the UK, but the UK SDS are going to be based on these IFRS standards. So these are going to be a good guidance and good way of getting involved in it to start with. The UK SDS will cover corporate disclosures on the sustainability-related risks and opportunities the companies face, and they're due next year. So businesses need to be aware and start to stay up to date with the reporting requirements, but which businesses is it going to affect? So essentially, to start with, this directive, CSRD, is going to affect large companies at the outset. But we expect there's going to be this trickle-down effect as these organisations are required to disclose data on their supply chain emissions, so Scope 3. And that means those suppliers will also need to measure their emissions to enable them to report to the company who's caught by the legislation. So the ESRS standards will first apply in financial years 1st January next year to large listed public interest companies with more than 500 employees. But then after that, it's going to be a phased approach affecting different companies at different times, depending on which category the company falls into, and there are a number of factors that are taken into account. But in coming years, non-EU listed companies that meet 2 or more of those criteria, and also non-EU companies with net turnover of 150 million, with a subsidiary in the UK that conducts significant operations there. So how can businesses get ready? So for businesses, raising awareness within your business of the need to consider ESG issues and disclose ESG data. So start getting ready for forthcoming legislation. And this is an already important part of RFPs for the sales and procurement team. So as a law firm, we're encouraged to disclose, what activities, what ESG data we're disclosing, that kind of thing. And the second point is ESG clauses in contracts. So they can be used to effectively to ensure that suppliers comply with an ESG requirement and reduce potential greenwashing. So driving this compliance down the supply chain by including these clauses will hopefully reduce those key Scope 3 Guinness emissions that we heard about earlier. Mm-hmm. So let's have a look at some of those example clauses.
So other than the legislative changes that Ralph has outlined, some of our clients want to get ahead of the curve and drive their suppliers to do more for the environment. One of the ways that this can be done commercially in contracts that academic institutions or organizations and corporates have is by directly in the contract that they have with their suppliers. And Pear Inc. is one of those organizations. So Pear Inc. wants to encourage its suppliers to disclose more ESG-related data and how they impact the environment, so Pear can better understand its own carbon footprint for Scope 2 emissions. In addition to complying with legislative changes, Pear Inc. has asked us if there is anything else it can do from a legal perspective to achieve this. So Ralph and I regularly negotiate ESG clauses for our clients, which are both universities and companies. And this is a real clause that we negotiated on behalf of a supplier. The clause is currently drafted, sets out a number of different obligations, which the supplier has to bear the entire cost of doing and complying with. So the first one is they have to conduct regular assessments. The second is they have to set clear environmental targets and mitigate any risks. The third is that they also have to get third-party certification. And then the fourth is that the supplier has to manage its own supply chain, so flow down, and make sure that their suppliers have good environmental practices. This isn't just a light requirement or a nice to have. It can have real weight for the relationship and the commercial value. And there are costs attached. So if the supplier doesn't comply with any of these requirements, then they have breached a term of the agreement. Pear Inc. can issue a notice to the supplier to let them know that the term has been breached. They would then say have 30 days to fix it, and if they don't fix it, then Pear Inc. could terminate the agreement.
So that's a very specific way of dealing with it. But there's also other, what we call boilerplate language, which is the stuff you see at the end of the contract that rarely gets read. But generally there's a compliance with law clause there. And so what we do sometimes is tailor that compliance with law clause to include specific requirements on environmental laws. So you'll see there the supplier shall comply with all applicable laws regarding the environment, including etc. And it also includes other corporate social responsibility legislation like the Bribery Act, modern slavery and equality. So that is the G in ESG. And also another way of dealing with people who don't comply with those requirements is to have a specific right of termination related to a breach of that requirement. And that's what that second clause there does. So coming on to our third and final sector.
Well, what are the practical takeaways from today? Number one, please use standard licenses to avoid issues in the future. Open source by design for your ESG project. Have those conversations early. As Ralph outlined, ESG regulation is increasing and driving disclosure of information. Businesses should be aware of their reporting obligations, and university and organizations can push for more reporting requirements from their suppliers in their commercial contracts. And hopefully, more data means more open source projects that can tackle the climate crisis.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been a real pleasure. We're around all day. Thank you.